Hi, everyone. My name is Barb Kipreos, she, her. I'm currently on the stolen and unceded land of the Muskogee and Cherokee in what is today called Athens, Georgia. I'm sure I'm a new face to many of you. Brief background of who I am is I'm originally from Georgia, recently graduated for the Master's in Conservation Science at UC Irvine. Currently, I'm the Climate Justice Fellow at the American Bird Conservancy. And more generally, I'm most passionate about interweaving justice and community-centered approaches into our collaborative conservation work. Although I'm very early in my career, but I'm excited to be here today on behalf of the California Landscape Stewardship Network's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Roundtable for Healing Severed Connections, co-chaired by Jose Gonzalez and Shalana de Silva, two very wonderful people who are here today. This is the last of the 2022 Equity Leader Speaker Series. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope that the ideas that we discussed today go on to seed future endeavors with you and yours. Also, big thanks to the planning team and everyone who helped get this off the ground, especially Jose, Shalana, Devin, Lanjig, and Rob. It's my face up here, but it's 100% a group effort. But I know y'all are here to see Chanell Fletcher. And Chanell, I'll let you introduce yourself however you'd like to. I'll just say that Chanell is the Deputy Executive Officer for Environmental Justice at the California Air Resources Board. She leads the implementation of AB 617 and was previously the Executive Director of Climate Plan, in addition to her work on many other environmental, racial, and climate justice organizations. We're very honored for you to be here, and I'm very excited about our conversation. So with that, Chanell, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, first of all, I am so sorry for being late. Thought I was prepared, and then I was like, wait, I can't find the Zoom link. So my apologies there. I'm also, just as a heads up for everybody, getting over RSV. Um, so that's just like my PSA, everybody stay safe. I don't know. I want to say mask up, but I mean, whatever you need to do, because this was definitely brutal. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm really excited. I definitely worked with Devin and Jose and Shalana on the agenda. So Barb, I'm super excited to be talking with you, and I'm excited for what we're going to get into. Outside of the professional titles, right? So I am the Deputy Executive Officer of Environmental Justice at CARB. I am the first deputy, and so the first deputy of environmental justice. Previously, they only had an assistant deputy, so it's actually a fairly big deal, I think, within government and kind of having that executive level environmental justice position. There is a lot of expectations and responsibilities that come with that. So happy to get into some of that, but I think it's definitely a challenging role. And I found that many of the same issues that I would experience when I was working in the nonprofit sector, particularly if you're looking at that intersection right between racial equity and land use, transportation, housing, I often felt like we were under-resourced, overcommitted, and generally just stretched so thin. And so it's very interesting to be in the government setting where, although there's many resources, I still find for the work around environmental justice, there's a lot of verbal commitment and prioritization, but that's not always seen, I think, on the side of resources and capacity. So that continues to be a challenge. But I did say outside of that. So outside of that, I am the mom of two. So I have two boys. I am pregnant with my third. Oh my God.
Right.
So I'm 15 weeks pregnant. Thank you. This was it was a surprise baby. And I feel like every parent has said to me, and our parent friend group has been like, oh my God, I'm so happy for you. And then the next sentence is, I'm so glad it's not me. And so, and that's mostly if you have kids, when you're a little older, you'll get that one. But we're really excited. I am also I'm very excited, but I'm definitely preparing my body for this to be my last, because it's been a little bit taxing. And then in addition to being a mom, and a partner to an awesome partner, I also just in general have a lot of interest in terms of reading. And so been really focused and interested in sci-fi, fantasy, and that kind of fiction. So I think a lot of Octavia Butler. And if there's ever interest in I don't know, some kind of book club around sci-fi, fantasy, exploring women of color, I'm always down for that. So those are just fun tidbits about me, again, outside the professional context, but super excited for the conversation. And Barb, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I will take you up on that book club. Um, yeah. Oh, and maybe let me also introduce myself as a whole person and not just what I do. But I also like tapestry and printmaking and that type of stuff. And I have an identical twin sister. She's in Canada, no children. But yeah, before we get into like the good stuff, because there's a lot of threads I wanted to pick up there. I would like to also remind everyone in the audience to make sure that you're muted and that we are going to be recording this. If you turn off your video, no one will be able to see you though, so you're all good. We will be accepting questions for Chanell in the chat box, which we'll try our best to get to towards the end of our talk. And yeah, so let's see. So Chanell, I know that this is like the first leadership position within CARB to focus on like relationship building and policy making that centers like justice. And it, which is relevant for the entire agency. And that's really exciting. And it's really important. What life experiences have helped you that you lean on in your personal and professional journey so far?
That is a great question. And I think so there have been a couple of big ones. I would say just most recently, so before I was at the California Air Resources Board, right, also CARB. And if I use any acronyms, by the way, because government is filled with acronyms, please just check me in the chat because I'm trying hard to remember to explain these acronyms. But before I was at a CARB, I was at Climate Plan for years. And so that to me felt like one place where I actually got a lot of experience around relationship building. And though for those who don't know, Climate Plan, it's a network of nonprofit organizations, and it really coalesced actually after the passage of AB 32, right, a big kind of global climate change law. And what it was really focused on at the time was that, well, we just made this big commitment, right, around a clear target of where we want to get to and how we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and really address climate change in a meaningful way. And there was a lot of concern from this group that was really looking at, well, wait a second, the largest, emitter of greenhouse gas emissions is transportation. And yet we're really not seeing a concerted focus looking at transportation, land use, right? So how communities are being planned and developed, and housing, right? We're not seeing that approach within AB 32. And so this group really worked together to pass SB 375, which set regional greenhouse gas targets to really kind of look at that intersection of land use, transportation, and housing, and how we could reduce GHG emissions through better planning, right? So better thinking about, well, where are the schools being located? Where are our transit lines being located? Where are our housing being located? Where's our affordable housing, right? Those conversations. Oh, sorry. And so through that work and through Climate Plan, I really started to think about the intersections because I think at first when we kind of initially started, we had a lot of environmental groups, right? So I would say your NRDCs, right? Nature Conservancy. I think Liz is on here, so hey, Liz. And then that wasn't a negative thing, right? Because they're really looking at land use and the environment and how we are planning for our communities and thinking about that. And that's actually a beautiful thing. But what I think we realize is that, well, wait a second, we can't do this work in a vacuum, right? So we actually do need to start thinking about what are the equity impacts of where our housing is located, right? That actually gets into environmental justice and the history of environmental justice, because then you're looking at, oh, wow, there's a high intentional prevalence of having low income communities being located near our environmental hazards. What's that about, right? Then you start to kind of unpack looking at the role of freeways, right? Kind of going right through our city centers. And then again, when you're thinking about sustainable, when you're thinking about environmental, land use, part of that is thinking about, well, who's working on those issues and how do we bring them into the fold? Because if we really do want better communities, it means that it just can't be one single group working on this together. And that's really the mission of Climate Plan. So I had a lot of those conversations and they weren't always easy, right? Because you were bringing together, it was environmental justice, it was equity, it was environmental groups, it was clean air advocates. And it's not that everybody didn't have the same vision for what they wanted, but the challenge is, I think, is a lot of it is in how do we get there and the education that everybody has. So I think that was that to me was really formative, especially now coming into CARB, which is an agency that's really focused on clean air and climate change. And I think when you're talking about environmental justice and racial equity, that I think has been for the agency, it's been a challenge, but being able to lean on that previous experience has really helped me to figure out, well, how are the ways that we can structure this conversation and how we can bring in, I think, different communities, different residents, different organizations, and how do we kind of like acknowledge the ways in which we have plans without considering those things, and how do we then adjust and go forward and think about those things. And I think there's a big conversation there for me always about how far do you go back in terms of like reparations, for example, and how much do you look ahead and look forward. And I think that's a tension that you live in those spaces. But again, that experience at Climate Plan helped.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I love that. Because like in my mind, it's all about like, within an issue, seeing how what looks like a solution for one, like, field, like conservation, can actually be like a really bad problem for other fields and other people, other groups. But also keeping in mind that like, we only have the present moment, but on either side is our work. And so if it's like, if you have systems of oppression built into the history of transportation, your solutions have to tackle that. Otherwise, you're just like having a good time with greenhouse gases, not really doing much. So yeah, so we know that government has a big role to play in ensuring that the reduction of greenhouse gases happens equitably. My question is, what like ideas, solutions, processes are like within your reach now that you're most passionate about implementing? And also, maybe do you have like a larger picture, a visioning of what, solutions you would like eventually, but are maybe not within reach yet?
I do, but you said something that I want to respond to when you talked about like having histories of oppression built in. So I'm going to answer your two questions, but I wanted to touch on that because I think you asked professionally and personally. And so I think this is something that I transparently wrestle with because when I think about my personal background and what I grew up with, like I grew up with a father that was very much a teacher and a student of history. And so some of my most formative memories are with my dad. And I think, for example, I'm gonna date myself because I'm pretty sure the movie Malcolm X, which is by Spike Lee, came out in like '92. And I remember like my dad and I going to the theater and watching that, right? And so and I remember watching that movie or watching movies about these civil rights icons like Medgar Evers, right? Martin Luther King is an obvious one, Rosa Parks, right? Like Emmett Till, like right, like you kind of have these icons. And I remember at that time kind of growing up, right? And that kind of changed my directory in college where I really ended up focusing a lot looking at civil rights movements, not just in the United States, but actually really kind of like across the world. And I remember thinking and that kind of struggle, right? And I think it's a real question, right? Of like, for most of the places and the spaces that we operate in, they are built off of like a history of oppression, right? So that's yeah, you look at United States, you can look at, I mean, so many, right? So many of what is built, we're built around, what we're responding to comes from a space of oppression. And so as a young Chanel, as a college student, and even now, I wrestle so much with how much of the work is to basically uproot, right? How much of it is to dismantle, how much of it is to, basically eradicate, right? And just start over. And how much of it is that, well, we got this history, we have these structures. How many incremental changes and tweaks do you do to fix them, right? Like, and at what point do you say this cannot be fixed? We actually have to start over. And so I think that's something, that challenged me, right? And so I could probably look at like the civil rights movement, right? To me, which felt like, okay, we know we have this discrimination in place, right? And so we're going to use these different like legal kind of like forums to address it, right? And then I can look at um like the country of Haiti, for example, right, which had like the first and I think one of the few like successful slave revolts, right, where you actually see them basically saying, no, we're going to overthrow these oppressors. But then you see when you're looking at the country of Haiti, part of why it is so decimated economically is because after they overthrew, right, these oppressors, all the countries around them did a big, huge embargo and basically said, we are not going to trade with you at all. And so there's some implications, right, around like dismantling and like eradicating, because then I think if you're relying on others to support you, then like that's where the challenges come in. So I think in this work with that I do, that's constantly what in some ways I'm wrestling with and what I'm grappling with. And I bring that kind of personal context because when we're, it's one of the things that's in my purview is AB 617, and I don't know how many people are familiar with it. If you're not, it was basically passed in correlation with cap and trade. So cap and trade, the extension of cap and trade was AB 398. And with cap and trade, there was a lot of concern, right? There's a lot of concern that in effect what cap and trade does. And again, I'm not saying it's true or not, just the concern has been that it continues to build on the pollution for those that are already the most impacted, right? So if you live in this community and you have, an emitter and they're able to trade, right? They're able to make those trades to address their emissions, then in effect, those communities actually aren't seeing their emissions being reduced. And in effect, they can see those emissions increase because they're able to make those trades, make it possible. So they're not actually getting the reductions that they need to see cleaner air. And so with AB 617, the idea was that, well, this bill, it's an environmental justice centered bill. It's going to address localized pollution, right? And so communities are going to work with the air district, the California Air Resources Board, to develop a plan to really get those emission reductions and get to that cleaner air. And so, right, so I think, and in some ways you'll hear some environmental justice organizations say, well, 617 was just the poison pill that we had to swallow for them to get cap and trade through. And that's, again, I'm not condoning anything. I'm just kind of expressing what I've heard. But I think the challenges with something like 617 in government, are significant, right? Because we don't actually have a framework in government for working in partnership with communities on something. And so typically, if you've ever been involved in government, it's generally like you have advisory committees, right? You have public workshops. And these are spaces where we as a government entity develop up like a plan to address the problem, and then we share it out with the public. We get your input, we take that back, we incorporate your input, we send out a revised plan, you give us additional comments, and we say, okay, here's what we can do according to statute, here's what we can't do according to statute, and here is the final plan that then gets adopted. And that's generally, I would say, how most things happen. So with 617, it was a bit revolutionary in the sense of like, well, how do you co-create something, right? Like, where does the power live? Who has the power? Who doesn't have the power? And in this case, right, we're talking about air districts and communities and CARB, who ultimately has the final say on this. And I think those have been conversations that have been ongoing. And then, for example, if there's complaints, right, like if the communities are feeling as they're not being heard by the air districts or CARB, who do they ultimately go to? Like, who's holding it accountable? And those are all things that I think we've had to wrestle with in that program. And I'm not saying we figured everything out, but it's been to me a really interesting study in like what do we do, right? So like what do we do when we're talking about environmental justice in the context of government, and when we're trying to address problems around environmental justice like localized pollution? How do we do it? How do we share power? I mean, these are big questions that we generally in government don't have to wrestle with, but in this case we do. And who ultimately holds you accountable? So again, no easy answers, but I do think it's been interesting. The other point that I'll layer though is that even though we're engaged in this process through 617, I mean, ultimately, as we pointed out, right, like, whether it's CARB or the air districts, we too, right, we have our own history of oppression that we are bringing to the table as entities of government. Um, and and I think, and there's also our own struggles with the power structures that we have in place, some of that which is even above ourselves, that we do have to think through. So I kind of end again with like, I have a lot of questions of like, what does this look like? How do we do this? And how do we have these conversations transparently, knowing that not everybody has, I think, the same education or the same understanding of these issues?
No, definitely. You mentioned a lot of really fantastic, interesting things that I'd like to pick up. But yeah, something about you said earlier about like in your childhood, going to see Malcolm X movies and stuff. It brought to mind like Rebecca Solnit's quotes about like, that we live by stories and die by stories, and that like stories are freedom. And that really resonated with me. I'm half Chinese, half white. And so, but I grew up mostly with just the white side. I was disconnected from my culture on the other side. And I'm just now coming back to that. And it's the stories that you tell yourself about your people and what's going on, and actually like, getting re in touch with that changes everything, I guess. But also, yeah. And then something that you mentioned about the tension about radical change versus incremental, like within the system versus like tearing it down. That resonated with me too, because it's like that's something that I've been struggling with, where I guess the more you learn about these systems, the more you kind of just want to start over, because it's like there's so many good solutions that you could do, but to get there it would take generations, right? So it's like if we have everyone on the same page now, couldn't we just implement some like radical ideas, like, why are we like privatizing property, that type of stuff. But yeah, but your point about Haiti was that something interesting about them was that they started from scratch, but you can never fully integrate or extract yourself from the system that you're in. They're still like paying today, I think, to France for their freedom. And so, yeah, I'm really curious about your perspective on that tension between like working within government to create that incremental change, versus like, I guess, working with more radical activists, or like, activists in general who are trying to create systems with new tools, especially with cap and trade, which, it took the tools we already have, but commodifying things and just letting the free market have it as a solution. And that kind of created more problems like what you're talking about.
Yeah. Oh my God, you did such a great job of bringing those together, because I felt like I was like, I hope that like made sense, that connection. Because I think that's what it is for me, is that um when I think about, and if you can't tell, my undergrad was in history, and then my graduate work was in like city and regional planning. And so history plays a big role in a lot of the work that I do. And so when I think about the systems, right, that we're in, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to get to, the example of Haiti, right? That it's like, even if you are able to like overthrow something, um, what I think tends to happen is that there's still like the ecosystem that you are a part of that still tends to shape it. And so I think, and what to me, what's been challenging, right, is that so much of what we do in our government is, like I said, it's incremental, and so often we are going back to um, the foundations of like what we were built around, and to like help us think through how we kind of are going forward, right? So I'm not, I mean, the cap and trade stuff is, it's like I said, it's a thorny issue. I've definitely heard both sides. Obviously, we at CARB, right? We kind of administer and run that cap and trade program. And I think there's a real question there, right? And I've asked myself this question myself, I've asked it of others, of if we didn't have this in place, right? Like, what would the impacts be? Um, because I think I remember, and we spent a lot of time kind of like thinking through what are the different options and the mechanisms. And there was like at one point like a carbon tax, and I don't mean to relitigate any of that. But I remember how much people hated the idea of a carbon tax. And it was people of the public that actually hated this idea of a carbon tax, and the idea of like, no, we don't want that. We don't want to have to pay for this, right? But it's funny because in some ways you're like, well, you're paying for it no matter what, right? And so in some ways, right, the cap and trade was kind of like the easier of the two to get through, to address this challenge around greenhouse gases emissions and how we reduce them. Um, so I think that to me is the crux there when we're talking about like incrementalism versus radical change, is that and I mean, I think this can be, to be honest, like applied to many things, right? It's that there almost has to be like the will for it to happen. And And I don't know if I see that. And I mean, I'm using things like cap and trade as an example, but I could take it, like I said, closer to the programs that I have, right? So with 617, for example, we're working through so much, um, and like trying to wrestle with like how are we doing all these different process points, but we still get the claim of people saying, well, what's the impact of 617? What have you actually seen being reduced in terms of emission? How have communities, actually improved? And I think it depends on how you measure that. Like, I do think that we've actually been able to do a lot of progress around pesticides and elevating that issue. I think particularly if you're like in a rural community, and you're feeling the impacts of pesticide application and how that impacts your breathing, your health, right? Like that's something that 617 really highlighted and daylighted. The idea of communities actually working collaboratively with the districts to identify the emission sources and how to like start thinking about how to reduce them. Again, big, huge thing that like has never happened before. And yet I think the funding for if you look at the funding for like our cap and trade program versus the funding from our 617 program, it's completely they don't match at all. One is relatively flat funding, another one is getting like billions of dollars. And I'm not trying to pit them against each other. I'm just trying to point out that um some could probably say that like, well, cap and trade is this big, thing that's doing so much. In the 617 program, we're still not sure what the benefits are. Whereas I think for me in my mind, it's like, well, how are we counting those benefits and how are we actually thinking about those when we're talking about the changes that we want to see? And I guess the last point I'll make, kind of going back to a question on incremental versus radical change, I keep coming back to the will, and the perseverance, because I think part of with the radical change, it's in some ways it's understanding what we currently have in place. At least I think it is, to understand what you actually need to dismantle. And I think it takes time to understand what's currently in place. And then I think it takes time to figure out, well, what is going to actually be better. And then I think it takes time to actually figure out how to actually implement that in and to build that kind of like political will and to build that. And that's all perseverance. And so I don't know. It's a lot to ask of people. And so I think that's part of to me the challenge and why sometimes it's easier to default into like incremental change.
Yeah, no, definitely. That was a fantastic answer. Yeah, there back to your point about there has to be a will for radical change. For me, that really connects back to your what you were saying earlier about stories, because it's like if you can't imagine what the future is going to look like if these things were to be dismantled, you're never going to walk into the unknown where like the well-being of yourself and your family and everyone and everything you care about is just like a blank slate. You're not really sure what it looks like. So the importance of stories, for one, seeing where we've been, but also where are we going, like what future are do you love that you're willing to fight for, but also pulling back to your outcomes, your question about like what are the outcomes, what are we valuing? That's something that I've kind of been grappling with too, about like outcomes versus like processes. Um, you know, I think sometimes we get too caught up, and I think someone said this is a white supremacist tendency of like just wanting numbers, and not really being okay with, I guess, qualitative data, but then also with having the process be also part of like the solution in the goal. Because what you're talking about earlier with like how do we get power back to these communities, if let's say there's like a way for us to lower emissions and lower greenhouse gases, in general, is that what we want, or is it that we want there to be power, dispersed? I guess I'm asking, is the distribution of power, do you see that as like the goal in and of itself? And you think that's, or do you think that's the best way to get to the lowered emissions for air pollution within communities? You know what I mean?
I do. And I'm only laughing because I was in a meeting at work today, right before this. And it was an equity focused meeting. And I was talking about perfectionism. And I was almost gonna say, well, that's like a symptom of white supremacy culture. And I was like, you know what? This group that I was talking to, I was like, you guys haven't had that orientation on white supremacy culture. And so therefore I probably won't mention it. But I appreciate that you brought it up because I do think that that's something that I don't know is always named. And I don't think people even understand what can be meant by white supremacy culture, but there's so much of I think what we do both in the government space, but also myself, right? Like I think that all I have to do like all of the time is honestly, a colleague said it best, like decolonize my own self because I can find myself falling into those tendencies as well, where I think it's being a very outcome driven focus versus right, like I want to get to this outcome, and so therefore I will set up this process to achieve this outcome versus allowing the process to dictate the outcome. And I think that's actually it's a challenge, right? Because then the outcome becomes much more open-ended. Um, I think many environmental justice organizations would answer the question with like a redistribution of power would be the priority. And the priority would be like, how do we get the power back to the people? Um, I don't know if I would say that government to me in that way operates that way. And so um, I think, at least from what I've seen, and I don't mean to say that they're not trying to get power to the people, but it often feels like part of giving power back to the people is by making sure that the outcomes that or like the legislation that we come up with centers their voice, right? In terms of like what we're trying to do. Um, so then and then I think by default, when you're an implementer, the outcome becomes the priority, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit of a weird way of like the legislature is working with communities to develop this and to like push for, for example, um, uh, setbacks, right? For example, was a big one that I think I heard a lot from environmental justice communities in terms of the proximity of oil and gas near like their community homes or schools, for example, was one big thing. And so, but then I think as an implementer, your focus becomes then like the setbacks and how you implement that. And so that's probably the tension that I guess I'm feeling and I'm answering your question is as an implementer, I think by default, we end up focusing on the outcome that comes from the legislation. And so part of what you're hoping in that process is that people's voices are centered, right? And power is being like redistributed in that process. Um, and I guess I'll end with the other challenge is that I think we wrestle with a lot is if this is our outcome and we run a process to get to this outcome, and in that process, something else comes up that is not the outcome that we were pushing for, but something new, I think there's always a constant struggle of, you know, do you give this the standard answer of like, well, that's not in our purview. Our purview is this outcome here. And we'll share that, that feedback with like the respective agency. Or do you follow the community's lead on that and try to think through, well, this is interesting. This is not what we were supposed to be focusing on, but I wonder how we can like brainstorm that some more and think through that with the agency. And I think, that's again, right? It's to me, it's again, it's a shift in thinking. It's not, I wouldn't say that radical like change of like, well, we're gonna uproot everything and just get rid of that outcome and focus on what you want to hear. But I think even that shift, is not always consistently implemented and is still like a challenge. So yeah, I don't know if that was a fair answer to your question, but I think those are the things that I think I'm still kind of wrestling with and or thinking through.
Yeah, no, that's fair. You don't need to have the answers.
Oh,
Um,
good. That's good because I definitely don't.
I barely got the questions. But back to your point about like decolonizing yourself, I think that sometimes for me, you look at these big systems and you just feel so powerless. Like 'cause you can't dismantle all of these things. Even with a lot of people, it would be like near impossible. So it's like, I think for me, it's always been like, okay, well, these big systems are really just lots of different little tiny people and they're perpetuating the system. And so I think what you were talking earlier about decolonizing yourself is like a way to take agency back on that and just not feel powerless against the system. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But yeah, about like, community centered work, I think it is a lot of it is like ceding control and like having like I guess having things emerge because when you're ceding control, as in like you're not really sure what the outcome is going to be, you just have faith in the process, and then whatever the community picks up on, or like presents as their needs, that's the focus. I think that's really interesting, and it's yeah. Could you talk a little bit about like, letting not letting communities, but like, I guess self-determination in communities and what identifying what they need and what they'd want the government to do?
I can definitely talk about it. I don't know if I have answers on it, if I can talk about it. But we've already established that, it's kind of tough answers. I think there are certain things that lend themselves to self-determination more than others. And so I would say maybe the 617 process lends itself more to self-determination. I would say a process like the scoping plan it's not that communities can't determine what they would want to see for themselves in terms of our climate work. It's that I think the challenge is that you have so many executive orders and laws dictating what the outcomes or what we're trying to get to, is that it's hard to it's hard to address all of it. And so I think that's the challenge, I would say. And I mean, it's not just like the scoping plan, right? Like I think you could really point to like we had a draft funding plan where we had like billions of dollars. And we were trying to think about, well, like how do we take these billions of dollars that are meant to like really, I think, focus on like light duty vehicles and equities, making sure that equity is prioritized throughout the distribution of this funding and making sure that we're really shifting into cleaner cars for everyone, right? And even with that, right, like you have a sense of like, like this is like the executive order or this is like the legislation that's directing how the money is supposed to be spent. And then you have the room to work with communities to figure out, well, where do you want to see it go? And I think that I probably would say to me is the challenge of like being in the implementer space, is that there can be a lot of gray, I think, where you can, I think, have that self-determination and you can have those community priorities. And then there are places where it's actually very clear and it's harder to do. And so one example is that we got a comment from some members of the public where they were like, we want to see more of this investment go into Black communities. And the Black communities are falling behind. Not enough of this money is going there. And then this will date me again, but like Prop 209 was passed, right? And what it basically did was eliminate like any forms of affirmative action. And so in terms of like hiring, in terms of funding, right, you can't use kind of race in those as a criteria. And so that honestly has been a challenge when we're hearing from specific communities, you know, we're not getting the money, and we're trying to figure out, well, how do we make sure that communities are getting these fundings while we have the challenges of Prop 209 in place, and we know that we can't use race as a criteria for our funding positions, our funding decisions. And that's just one example, right, of where I think it's like very clear, but we're also hearing, communities speak up for themselves and saying what they need based off of like their race. And so I think that is the challenge to me, is that you're kind of in this place of like there is some gray and there is some places where there's lots of like agency, and there's other places where it's very clear and you don't have that agency, and then you're trying to figure out how can we address this and how can we partner with you.
Yeah, and I would love to talk more about like barriers to like self-determination. I also would this whole year for me has been kind of a theme of like, oh yeah, there is joy in this work. Let me pivot towards that. That's something Jose Gonzalez says a lot. But yeah, so are there any sort of things that like in your wildest dreams you would love for this like solution to be implemented and it would, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not all gloom and doom. There is joy in the work. I mean, I think in my wildest dreams, I think a lot of the environmental justice, programs and staff actually getting the resources and the capacity they need. That's something that I've really been pushing for, because so much of the work, like I said, it feels like you're trying to be creative and figure out how to do this, and your resources are so few and so limited. So that's one thing that would be kind of huge. I actually think a really just more spaces like this where you can kind of have those conversations, and it doesn't have to be so linear. And I think that's something that I've, when we were doing the prep for this, I remember being like, well, I love the opportunity to be a little bit expansive. And I think about Adrienne Marie Brown when she says like, you want more presence and less prep. And I think about that a lot because, most of the prep is like, well, I want to create this linear, cohesive picture, right? That everybody can understand, we can all get behind, and then we can all move forward on. And I'm not saying there's not a place for that, but I also think there's a place for bigger conversations where you are like looking at different forms of history and different pieces of history and different mediums, and you're thinking through what does freedom look like, right? Like, what does justice look like? When we talk about the vision of what we want um, our future to be, our communities to look like, our children to play in, like, can we have those expansive conversations and can we draw on all the spectrums of our lives to inform that? That would be something that I think would be really beautiful. And I don't think we often have the space or the autonomy to engage in those conversations and to bring our full selves. Um, One of the places where I do find joy in this work is that because I'm in a higher position, I'm able to bring more of my full self into the work that I do, and not everybody has that luxury. So that's something that I find a lot of joy in. I find a lot of joy in the fact that at least at the agency that I work at, so many people are so passionate and have not just questions, but like what they want to do and what they want to see and how they want to see change happen. And I think that, and to me, like that's been exciting to see, right? And I think for people to be able to feel comfortable to speak up and to say that truth, um, that's been really huge. And then I think the last part I'd say where I find joy in is being able to model um, what it looks like to hear people react and respond and to start to kind of name your own emotions, right? Like I just had a meeting where I was like, wow, I'm feeling a little bit defensive. So I want to just name that and be transparent that I'm feeling a little defensive, but we can keep having the conversation. And I don't think, again, like we don't always come to work with our whole selves or feel comfortable naming emotions, especially I think as like women. We're often like, right, you're hysterical or you're too emotional or you're too sensitive. And so being able to kind of like address that patriarchy and call that out and just be able to be like, I can be triggered, I can be defensive, I can be angry, right? I can have a whole spectrum of emotion and still be, a whole person, a whole human, a whole employee. I think those are things that I find a lot of joy in.
Yeah, no, definitely. I feel like similarly about like a lot of the joy comes from being fully present and having those collaborative moments where you're people connecting and you're not just like job positions connecting. So thank you for speaking on that. We are running low on time, so I will go to the questions that people offered. So one question is they would like advice that you can offer for connecting with the environmental justice community on an issue that historically has not involved people of color, but affect them more than others. Specifically, what is the right process to initiate respectful outreach and build partnership?
Ooh, that's a good question. I always tell people to start out in the space of relationship building. And so I find it the most helpful to not try to connect and like, hey, like my name is Chanel and I want to contact you about this policy, issue. But I think to come into this space and basically say like, hey, right, like I'm Chanel, I'm working on this stuff, but I really want to hear from you. I want to learn more about the work that you're doing, what you're interested in, and allow the person to lead you in the conversation. I found and I mean, I found that that's been a helpful way to start again building relationships by actually being engaged and interested in like what they're interested in and leading with what they're interested in. And then I think I found that it's like, inevitably the conversation comes back to me and then I'm able to be like, oh, this was so helpful to hear. It's helpful to know kind of how you're moving. And if it still makes sense, then I'll generally bring up I'm working on this policy and I'm just curious, are you interested in this? And if you're not, like, who should I talk to? Who should I reach out to? Because in general, I mean, two things. Most environmental justice groups are completely and utterly tired of being like the resource, right? You know, and I mean, we all get that. Like, nobody wants to be like on the dial for like, I'm your like, EJ, help, call a friend or whatever. Um, but I genuinely believe that most kind of like groups want to be engaged and be helpful, and no one wants to like miss something. So that would be the approach that I would take, and hopefully that's helpful.
I mean, that sounds helpful to me. Yeah, something that like I've heard people say in the CLSN is about having relationships for like the sake of relationships. And I like how you were saying not to lead with your ask or because then it's kind of communicating that this relationship is not contingent on a transaction of like I'm not just trying to get something out of you. Like if like our interests are not aligned, I still want to know you and be in community with you. So yeah, I really appreciate that. We do have one more question. Oh, yes, this one's just an extension of the other one about how can those of us working on nature-based solutions be better partner to EJ advocates? Would you like to speak on that or a different question?
No, happy to. And I mean, I think I forgot that I was going to talk about 1757.
Oh, please talk about that.
Well, no, I think it ties in, which is like which is haha, it's an advisory committee. Here's the thing. I genuinely, especially because I think when we're talking about nature-based solutions and natural working lands, um, I had a really interesting conversation with somebody where they were saying we want to get like more environmental justice, organizations and communities engaged in this, but I don't know like who's working on this or like really who's like the expert in this. And I remember kind of flipping the question and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because I think on my end, I've always been curious on what are the ways in which the solutions that we're working on to address, right, like nature, like how are they grounded in, I think, the principles of environmental justice, and who is helping to inform and shape them. And so part of my response in that was, who are you able to invite to the table to be a part of the creation? Because I think for me, for example, in my work, I wouldn't say I've ever been an expert on anything, but it's really been people saying, hey, like, I know that you are grounded like in these principles around racial equity. Can we invite you into this conversation and kind of get your thoughts on something I'm working on? And it was definitely framed as more of like an offer that I could say no to than like, we want to pull you in on this meeting. Um, so I think that's one thing that I would say is asking yourself the question of like, well, who's helping us to inform this? And where are we missing? Where are we having gaps at? One of the things that I put we would elevate is that we've been doing more work with tribes. And I know that we just actually had one of our environmental justice advisory committee meetings up in the Hoopa Valley with the Hoopa Valley tribe. And they had brought up a lot of concerns around um, are feeling as though people were offering up a lot of solutions around wildfires while not acknowledging and or attributing those solutions back to right like tribal traditions. And so there's a lot of questions of like, well, who's doing this and how do we get connected to them? And I remember thinking, oh, this is interesting because I think this is a place where I think like we in government can be a good connector, but also if you're asking the question of who's informing, right? Like you can start to think about, well, who can I reach out to? Who do I want to reach out to? And if it's like, I don't know anybody to reach out to, it seems like already in this network and in this space, you can start to like be able to have some of those conversations and figure out like, hey, well, can you help me identify people to again talk to learn more from, and then to share out what I'm thinking about. So that's a roundabout answer, but I think the point of it is to do some of that self-interrogation and figure out if there are any gaps in terms of how you're already doing the work, and if there are, thinking through how do I find partners to kind of help, I think, ground truth the solutions that we're coming up with, and doing that in a way where we're not making it transactional.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like partnerships are definitely key because I think so often we just assume that the work is not getting done and then we start from scratch. And that's always a waste of, time and resources when you're just redoing the work of other people because you didn't know who to reach out to in a network. But we are almost out of time. I believe I'm in Georgia, so it's 4 for me. But and I can't do quick math. But uh I'll let you have any closing thoughts, or was there something earlier that you wanted to expand upon that you didn't get a chance to, or any asks of the network maybe?
Um, Closing thoughts. I think I have 2 minutes on my end. So, um, one of the things that I did want to flag that I know that we've been working on in partnership with the Natural Resource Agency is 1757, and it's really around natural and working lands. And I think this is a place where we've actually had a lot of conversations in our climate work on, and really wanting to leverage the expertise, I think, of those that are in the field doing this work. And so, Natural Resources Agency, they already put out the ask for members of the public if you want to be part of that advisory committee to kind of help to shape that effort around, I think, our approach to natural and working lands and the climate context. That was one thing that I did want to flag. And even though I know that I had mentioned we have a lot of advisory committees, I think that there's still to me a lot of room within those advisory committees to really think about how we're using them and how we're being, I think, intentional in what we can and cannot do together. So I did wanna kind of, make the ask on that front, and if there are any questions about it, I'm happy to follow up offline too.
Great. Yeah. So in my end, we have, yeah, 1 minute left. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate you showing up as like your full self. And all the like the wonderful points that you brought up. I'm gonna have a lot of journaling to do later. Thinking about stuff.
Well, I think a huge gratitude and appreciation to you and everyone that kind of, pulled this together. It was really nice, and I remember telling, like I said, I told this to like Devin and Jose. I was like, it's gonna kind of just be like an insight into Chanel's brain as I'm wrestling with a lot of these concepts. So I appreciate everyone's time and space for thinking, helping me think through some of these things.
It's all